having identified the importance of user goals, in this section we're going to look at a number of different techniques that we can use to discover and model goals. And you can see several of them listed here on the screen, and collectively they come together to form what is quite a rigorous investigative approach. And that's important because in the last presentation we indicated we just can't simply ask the user what goals they have. Rather, we have to be more careful and try to infer and discover what those goals are. And there's a range of different techniques that we can use, from a kickoff meeting through to literature review to a product prototype competition reviews and stakeholder and expert interviews. And collectively they help provide and set the scene and help us contextualize some of the things that we then engage with when we're talking to our users. Importantly, they also let us understand some of the other types of goals, be they technical or customer goals or business goals that are important in terms of the bigger picture. We can use user and customer interviews, user observation, user surveys, focus group, card sortings. These are all activities we can do with our users. And through those activities we can get a good understanding then of what goals our users are employing, what's important to them. Now, whilst we're using these here as a way of discovering and understanding goals, it's not only that's not the only use that these techniques have. You can use them for lots of other aspects around the interface design and elements of it. So they're quite powerful techniques in and of their own right. So we'll take each in turn and we'll work through them. Now, if this is a project that is just commencing, it's at the very start of it, you're new to it, it's useful then to have an initial meeting at the start that brings together the key people associated with that project. The sponsors, the stakeholders, whoever's key to it. And they can be asked questions then in terms of, well, what is the scope? What is the software for? What do they think is important to the users? And those types of initial framing question, well, they're just that. They help provide an overarching structure to this. They then can direct and help shape further conversations with other people and ultimately with our users. We can link this in also with the literature review. And that involves really going through any sort of documentation that is pertinent or relevant to the project. It could be internal documents, that may be market analysis, information on the brand strategy, or other sort of technical specifications or constraints. It may be industry reports or other sort of wider sector reports. And it may also be information on what the competition is, what other options do people who are purchasing this type of service or software do they have available. And again, that type of information, it helps give us an understanding as to the environment we find ourselves in, the types of question that we may want to ask, and what sort of constraints may apply within that environment. Likewise, in terms of product, prototype and competition audit, that's a similar one, and it assumes here that there is an existing product or prototype that lets you look at. Certainly there should be competition, and again, by exploring all of these you can understand in terms of the feature set they have, the types of things that they sort of present or put forward as being important. And again, that helps establish very often sort of what is the state of the art, just how advanced things are, what is the competition, where are we starting off from, and it's really in that gives us a bit of a baseline, a bit of an understanding into that wider overarching picture. Stakeholder interviews then. So I suppose once you've got a bit of a reasonable understanding as to the area that we're sort of dealing with and some of the constraints, is useful then to have more refined follow-up conversations. And when we talk about stakeholders, we mean people who in some sense have responsibility or authority for the product or the software. The types of questions that are useful to explore with them, you can see some of them listed here on the screen. So it can be talking about, well, what is their vision for the product? What are the types of business or organizational drivers that they are operating to that's important to them? What sort of budget or time scheduling constraints may there be around this? Are there any sort of technical constraints as well? And it's also good then to get their perceptions of what they think is important for the users of this. So again, it helps give more rounded detail, introduces in some of their particular goals, which are important, which we're going to have to meet alongside our user goals as well. Overall, you see at the bottom that by talking to the stakeholders, it does help us establish a set of goals and constraints from their perspective, and that then is useful information when we're thinking about the viability of certain types of user interaction or user design. Subject matter or expert interviews. So where you have an area where there are experts, be they domain experts or people who are expert in this particular area that you're looking at, is good to have a chat with them, because they can provide valuable insight into some of the more expert-based elements of this. So they provide, again, a good understanding maybe into the competition that's available, a good understanding into some of the elements. Now, if you're operating inside an environment that is highly technical, is highly complex, or there's maybe legal or regulatory requirements, and that applies to quite a wide range of software, is good then to make sure that from a compliance and alignment point of view, if possible, that you have ongoing conversations with experts just to help keep things in alignment. One thing to be careful about, though, is that whilst obviously they're highly knowledgeable, they're experts in their particular domain, they're not designers. They probably don't know how best to create a design, how best to have that interaction. They may not appreciate the particular needs that beginning users have as well. So they provide a certain type of advice, but it's important then to understand the boundaries of that advice. Customer interviews. So this is looking at ones where you're talking to the individuals who are responsible for procurement, for purchasing this. And often, certainly within a business environment, those who are responsible for procurement may not be the users of the system. They typically are not. And obviously, because this is an important consideration, it is really important to understand the views, what's important then to the customers, because they will be making the decision whether or not they're going to invest in this particular product. So types of questions we can ask of them is, well, what outcomes do they want from their point of view? What do they see as the current frustrations with the existing product? And what aspects, if it is in terms of functionality, maintainability, just cost, value for money, what's the important elements then that feature into their decision-making process? Now, all of that's useful. It helps give us an understanding of the wider context, of the goals and hopes of other types of non-user. Ultimately, we do need to get down and talk to our users and to see what's important for them, because they're the most important constituent. They're the people who will be using our software. So most design attention should be placed, quite rightly, upon our users. And some of the questions we would want to understand of our user, well, we can see them here. We understand the context for them using the product. How, why, and when are they going to use it? What are the sort of constraints? Is it every single day? Is it occasional? What are their goals and motivations? What must the product be able to do if they're to be able to complete whatever tasks they have? What domain knowledge do they need? What do they need to understand or have access to enable them to do their job in terms of what they want to do? What mental models are they using? How do they think about the particular tasks that they're doing? And what problems or what frustrations do they have with the current setup, if there is a current setup? All of those are really useful aspects to tease out, to understand, which are really important then about how we progress with designing software around their needs. For interviews then, if we're running interviews, they do provide us a rich source of input into this here. For using interviews, they're best, not always most efficiently, but they're best conducted one-to-one. Interviews, they can help us understand user preferences and attitudes. But we're not using interviews to make any sort of judgment around usability or performance. We'll see that we'll look at performance and usability measurement later on as the means by which we can understand that. So if we're thinking about having our conversations with the user, the success of those interviews, it is fundamentally going to depend upon the questions that we asked. We should, through our questions, focus on what are the participants, their personal experiences. We shouldn't ask them to speculate in terms of what they think they might do or what others would do. The questions that we use, they should be simple, they should be neutral, and they should be open-ended. We want to avoid any type of question where there's any sort of potential or perception around that there is a correct or a preferred or a better answer. So neutral, simple, open-ended. If we keep our questions like that, we let the user express whatever is it they want to express. Because we know there are limitations to simply just talking to the user, it's useful also then that we explore user observation as another technique that we can have to understanding the goals of our users. And in this, just to highlight the bit at the top, I mean, the reason for this, to reiterate, is that if we're asking users direct questions, they will not want to come across as appearing to be incompetent. They won't want to come across as appearing to be impolite. And that means then that difficult or problematic topics, quite often people are not that willing to talk about them. So if we observe their behaviour firsthand, we do get a better insight into it. Ideally, the best way to do that is to be on site, to go into whatever environment users would naturally find themselves in, and then to simply observe how they work inside that environment. Now, it obviously needs to be done in a sensitive and in a relaxed manner. You want to and potentially over time as well, because that helps lessen the effect of the observer behavior. I mean, the image you can see here of somebody standing behind you with a clipboard peering at what you're doing, that's not going to be a comfortable position for most people, and they are unlikely to behave in a natural manner. So it has to be done with a certain amount of sensitivity over a certain amount of time so that users feel relaxed, they don't feel threatened, and then after a period, natural behaviours will emerge and arise. Absolutely, you can combine interviewing with observation. That's really quite powerful. So in terms of having a look and seeing how people do things, you can then follow up through interviewing with some specific questions around that if you want to sort of try to develop some nuance or tease out some details. User surveys we can also use. So in this sense, it's a survey. And in the next broad section, when we'll have a look at how we can measure usability metrics, we'll have a look at user reported value through surveys. Broadly, we give a group of users a set of questions. They're generally multiple choice questions, so there's constraints inside which they answer those questions. They're not open-ended. And because those questions are constrained, multiple choice or against a defined range, it enables us, if we want to generate some quantitative information from them. We can work out average values, and we can work out ranges and other types of aspects. We need to be careful in using the surveys in terms of our question design. So all of the things we were talking about when we're talking to our users, that we don't want to ask leading questions or questions where there appears to be a better or preferred answer. All of those considerations apply to the design of our questionnaires, but we'll have a look at that in the next big section. Focus groups, we can also use those too. They're more efficient than one-to-one interviews with users, but they also have some downside. So a focus group is where we bring together a group of users and ask them. It's typically a structured series of questions. So we would go in knowing the questions that we want to ask. It's not necessarily a free-for-all discussion. Rather, we are interested in structuring it and having specific questions. They're good if we want to gauge things like initial reactions, to show different options and to get a bit of initial feedback on it. They can be useful as well in terms of sort of getting that sort of broad group experience of how things have been in the past, what people feel about things. But they're not so good in terms of letting us understand how people use different aspects. And a downside of any group activity is that you can have group norms being established where you get the whole group orientating around a particular value, which represents a value for the group, but it may not indicate the diversity of view inside it. And sometimes they're also impacted by those who speak loudest or most passionately in terms of what establishes that sort of group value. So are of use, but it's also then important to understand their limitations. And the final thing we want to talk about in our sort of our toolbox of different techniques that we can use to understand the goals and the views of users and others is card sorting. And that's particularly helpful where we're trying to establish categories to work out how things are grouped together from the user's point of view. Now that's a bit different because it's potentially thinking about navigation structures, it's potentially thinking about how things are aligned and grouped together. And in essence, what users are provided then is with a set of cards that they're asked to group together. We can do it in a couple of ways. On the cards, we can either provide them with values already populated. So that's known as a closed sort. So we give them a set of cards with things written on them, and we ask them to group them together in whatever way they want to, based on whatever criteria we've set up. We can also give them blank cards or cards where we say, well, you can group them into any category you want to. We're not going to give you any categories. It's up to you to find what the most meaningful grouping is. So there's a range of different techniques and approaches you can use when you're looking at card sorting. They're useful because by observing what the users do and the thought processes they go through, as well as the final arrangement they end up with, that helps us identify where there are common pieces of agreement. Oh, everybody thinks these two things go together. And also where there are areas of confusion in terms of, well, this could go this could go with that. And seeing that sort of confusion and seeing how people think through their various thought processes in terms of arriving at whatever final set of groups they end up with, that's really quite useful. So card sorting is quite a useful one where you want to understand from the user's point of view how they relate or group different elements together. So that's all we want to look at in this section. We've explored at a very high level quite a wide range of different tools or techniques that we can use. All of them give us a bit of an insight into the goals that individuals have, from users through to customers to stakeholders. In the next section after this, we're going to go on to explore the idea of a persona, which is a really quite a powerful technique then of capturing and bringing together the views of our users that we would collect through all of the techniques we've talked about in this particular section.